Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today we have a special guest. We're speaking with an Iranian director whom we admire greatly. His films and the stories they tell are not only well made, but they come at great personal cost. Because he tells stories that reflect reality in Iran, he's been jailed multiple times and currently has left his country. His films include There Is No Evil, The White Meadows, A Man of Integrity, and this year's The Seed of the Sacred Fig. We're pleased to welcome Mohammad Rasoulof. Will be speaking with the help of an interpreter. Thank you, Mohammad, for doing this.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me in this program.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we'd like to ask you, and we've read quite a bit about you and watched as many films of yours as we could. We're just interested, how did you get into filmmaking? I believe you started studying sociology at university. What drew you into film? And were there filmmakers that inspired you as a young man?
علاقه من به سینما خیلی تحت تاثیر
So my passion for cinema really starts out from my passion for society and understanding what's happening around me. And in fact, I wanted to study filmmaking to begin with. But then I realized that what I really needed was an almost scientific, sociological outlook to study human societies, to better understand them. And so that's why I first studied sociology.
علم جامعه شناسی میتونه به آدم بده. از طرفی در هنر خیلی علاقه.
And in terms of art, I'm a great fan of creativity. I'm not really into conventional or classical ways of making films. And I've always loved experimenting and been very interested in trying out new routes, and that's why I was initially drawn to documentary cinema.
بعد از اون دیگه رابطه من با
but then I realized I was actually more interested in making fiction films, but they were inspired by documentaries. And that's where I started experimenting, really trying to find new forms and always searching for new discoveries. This way of filmmaking allows me to get to know better my surroundings.
در واقع میتونم بگم یه جوری خودمو همیشه یه
I think of myself firstly and foremostly as a student of cinema, as someone who loves cinema and who's curious about it, and a place where I'm always trying to learn something new.
It's interesting. We haven't seen the first film you did. I think it was called The Twilight, but we were watching it. We've seen Iron Island. Can you talk about how you got that film together? Where did the idea come from, and how did you finance it? How does it work in Iran, in the film industry?
فیلم اولم یه
So my first film is actually a docudrama made with the actual characters that recount and based on the true events that they experienced.
فیلم جزیره آهنی یه فیلم کاملا
Whereas Iron Island, my second film,
در واقع دومین فیلم من بود و
is an entirely fictional film. And it's born from my past in theatre and in fact a script that I'd once written for the theatre.
و در واقع من بعد از حدود مثلا
And so after about 10 years I adapted this
تغییر دادم برای
theatrical project in a way that could work cinematically.
من هیچ وقت خودمو یه فیلمسازی ندیده بودم که
So I never thought that my films would be seen by a large audience. I always thought that my films would be seen by sort of, quite selected, if you like, by small numbers. And then also I made films every few years, and the language that I used, the cinematic language I used, was a metaphorical language. And so Iron Island is based on a completely imaginary plot. But however, the story is told in a completely realistic manner. And I mostly financed the film personally with the help of friends and made it with a tiny budget, and we filmed on 35 millimeters.
And was it just chance that you found that location, that abandoned ship?
So I knew that there were one or two such ships in the south of Iran, but how I found this specific location was really out of luck and had to do with a friend I had working on an island in the south of Iran who told me that there is such a ship as the one you're looking for near here, how it was damaged during the war and it's now a military, it has a military function, and so if you want to film there you have to sort of satisfy the military. But then when I went to visit it, I realized there was only one person living on the ship, and he was the guardian of the place, and he was an elderly, a village man. So actually it was not at all difficult to convince him to allow me to shoot there. However, what was very difficult was recreating an atmosphere of life, of a lived space, and making certain additions to the ship that made it possible to believe that there could actually be people living there.
I want to ask a question about the story, because it acts as a metaphor for, a society with a monarch or under a dictatorship or whatever. But when the people are forced to abandon the ship at the end and the captain takes them ashore, and the film ends in the kind of, a wasteland, really, where the captain says they're going to build a town. I mean, I understand the film was a metaphor, but what was that a metaphor for? What was the meaning behind that end?
رویاهای مردم رو تبدیل به یه ابزاری برای حکومت کردن بهشون بکنن.
It's about how people's dreams are turned into a tool by structures of power that use these primary needs of people in society in order to rule upon them.
But is the end, are you meant to be left with some hope, or is the desolation, that's it? It felt, to me watching it felt hopeless.
نه، من فکر میکنم که برای بعضیا امید هست، برای بعضیا نیست. برای مردمی که
I think it depends. I think for some people who watch the film, there will be hope, and for others, there weren't. For instance, for those who want to gain power, there clearly is no hope. But perhaps for Baby Fish, whose aim was to go somewhere bigger, I think there is hope.
Then after this film, how was it received? Was it shown in cinemas in Iran? How was it received? I know it was received very well outside of your country, but
No,
I was never able to show this film publicly in Iran. And in fact, it was the beginning of all the problems I've had ever since with the censorship apparatus in Iran, because the film showed clearly what my ideas are. By now, they knew clearly what my ideas were about the whole system of power in Iran.
But then you went to on to make a film that, for me, The White Meadows is even more aggressive against dictatorship or superstition or kind of religious intolerance. Why did you choose to go that route? It's another very, very stylized view of a society, right?
فکر میکنم توی جوامع استبدادی خصوصاً در حالتی که استبداد
So I think that in a totalitarian society where religious has such dominance in people, the use of superstition but also of ignorance is very important. Power rides on the ignorance of people. And it was to me like a historical outlook on what I saw unfolding every day within Iranian society. Meaning how power can abuse people's religious beliefs and take advantage of them.
And how were you able to raise money to make that film if you were already on the government's radar? And how were you able to convince people to work with you?
فشار زیاد نشده بود.
So at the time there still wasn't as much pressure on me, and it was still possible to use metaphorical language, to tell certain stories without arousing too much anger, really, or too much suspicion. In terms of the financing, I self-produced the film. There was a 3.5-year interval, hiatus between Iron Island and this film, and during that time I was able to work on direct or produce rather lots of publicity, lots of advertising films, and that's how I managed to guarantee the funding for the film to self-produce it. Sorry, I forgot to add that also I made that film using permits for a short film, which of course told a different story to the film story.
That's great.
I think in the interim, we saw a documentary you made about satellite TV and DVDs being bootleg DVDs being imported into Iran. I'm kind of really interested about that because I started off in documentaries and I was always kind of nervous about filming people in a society where they could get in trouble if the higher ups saw them in a film. How did you approach that? That must have been actually more dangerous to shoot than actually either of your first two feature films.
آره من بعد از جزیره آهنی
So after making Iron Island, I asked for permits to make a new film on another story I was working on, and it kept being denied, and I was really kept waiting and for a long time. And during the 2 years that I was seeking these permits, I started making this film, which for me was really a way of witnessing society, and especially this ongoing, quite violent war between society and the government. And a society that was really desirous to see the unfiltered content that was being made abroad, entertaining content often, and that I wanted to be connected to. And so in a way I also occupied myself by making this documentary over that hiatus. Of course, it was very difficult convincing people to come in front of the camera, but I somehow managed.
Did any of them get in trouble for being in the film?
No, I never showed the film openly, so the regime couldn't really have access to too much information about who participated and how, and so I made it difficult for them, really.
Yeah.
And if that film didn't get shown, did White Meadows get shown in Iran at all? I mean, again, it was very successful outside of the country, but...
Maybe I should clarify this straight away, which is that I've made 8 films, and none of them have been screened publicly inside Iran. Never. So the way I connected with Iranian society, with my audience there, was really through the black market and through the underground routes whereby people download films and circulate them illegally, if you like, but that's how they see them. But luckily all of my films have been very successful outside of Iran, and I had this idea that it was a bit like launching a boomerang that would travel for a long while, hit a place, and bounce back to Iran.
So then I'm interested in, so the first 2 major films you made, Iron Island and White Meadows, are very metaphorical. And almost, I mean, I love Andrei Tarkovsky's movies, and they feel a little bit in that kind of vein. And then you made a film called Manuscripts Don't Burn, which seems like a totally different change of style and a change of way of communicating. It was much more directly about a social issue. Can you talk to that change of style?
من کیسارهای سپید و سال 2009 ساختم.
So I made White Meadows in 2009, and the end of the filming coincided with the 2009 protests.
شکل گرفت و من و دوست عزیزم آقای پناهی جعفر
and that's when I together with my dear friend Jafar Panahi
دستگیر شدیم و به زندان افتادیم.
We were both arrested whilst making a film and ended in prison, which afforded me an exceptional opportunity to reflect on why I was there and why the structure of power and the censorship apparatus in Iran have such a terror of cinema.
توی زندان خیلی از خودم سوال می‌کردم که چرا من با زبان
So in prison I also asked myself why I was using this metaphorical language, and I felt that I was using in order to protect myself out of the fear I harbored of power, and it was an aesthetics really born of this fear rather than of free choice.
اونجا یهویی به این فکر افتادم، گفتم ببین تو
And suddenly, I realized that when you're afraid, you turn into one part of the censorship mechanism. Because you're not ready to be yourself in your work, in your films.
اونجا تصمیم گرفتم که دیگه از اون لحظه بعد داستانامو مستقیم بگم.
And so I decided instead to start telling stories directly, and that if I were to use metaphor, it would be a clear aesthetical choice. It would be a storytelling technique rather than a way to cover up the fact that I was telling stories that trespassed all the red lines, really. And I decided with great joy to tell stories that would present the most direct image of Iranian society.
That must have been a great feeling, actually, to make that transition, I think, to just say what you mean.
Yeah, most importantly, what was fantastic was to feel that I am myself. It's a really positive feeling vis-a-vis totalitarianism that is always trying to empty people of who they are, take the self away from them. And so this was great, thinking also that I was no longer working out of fear, but that I was bringing forth a direct form of storytelling.
Can you talk a little bit about how you went about it? Because I can understand in a way, Iron Island and White Meadows were both shot in very remote places and it might have been easier for you to keep under the radar, but Manuscripts Don't Burn were actually in the city and involved some quite complicated exterior shots. Can you talk about your way of working? How did you have a very tight script? Did you storyboarded it? What was your way of working?
خب بعد از
I should add that after White Meadows, I made one more film, بoomerangs, Goodbye, which was presented at Cannes and it did very well. And it also brought to me a great proposition from a German producer to work on the film Mohan in 2012. But meanwhile, something had really stayed with me from the time I spent in solitary confinement.
وقتی که توی زندان انفرادی بودم این سوال که چرا به عنوان
from my time in solitary confinement, I was still asking myself, why as a filmmaker should I be serving time in prison? And I couldn't rid myself of this question. And it gave me a chance to start reflecting about the historical relationship between intellectualism, progressive thought, and power. And obviously by looking at the past, by taking a historical outlook, that would also enable me to reflect upon the future and wonder in which direction this relationship would evolve.
به مجردی که یه سفر اومدم.
So after making Goodbye, I was able to travel outside of Iran and to get hold of a series of books that were banned in Iran, but also meet people who were perhaps the greatest references on the topic I was researching and that these books were about, which are the serial murders of intellectuals in the late 1990s in Iran. And so that enabled me to do a great deal of research.
خوندن چند تا از این کتابا و
reading some of these books and researching thoroughly such a topic had a great impact on me. And despite already having a contract in place with a German producer, I beseeched him to give me some time, and during this time I made Manuscripts Don't Burn.
خیلی فیلم خطرناکی بود. یه گروه 5-6 نفره بودیم.
Yes, it was a very dangerous film to shoot. We were a tiny crew, meaning 5-6 people, by which I mean one person doing visuals, only one person working on the image, the DOP, only one person working on sound. We use this very small camera that in fact is a photographic camera, DSLR, and of course very limited equipment, and shot only about half of the film in Iran, the exterior scenes, and all the interior scenes instead we shot in a studio in Germany where we recreated this Iranian setup. And of course, one of the reasons also for shooting abroad was that we had huge problems in terms of the cast in Iran. We couldn't shoot with a large cast, and so that was the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
The story drew inspiration from the events, the true facts of the serial murders of intellectuals, artists, people who simply thought differently and unconventionally and showed how the security apparatus was just ready to murder them.
And how do you find cast for something like that? Because it is the cast whose face is in the film. As a crew person, you can kind of hide and maybe no one knows that you worked on that movie. But with the cast, it's very clear who worked on the movie. Do you have to, I guess you have to find someone that's willing to take the risk and also believe strongly in what you're doing.
That's exactly it. So I chose actors who really wanted to take part in the film, who were ready to accept the risks, but and also in terms of the actors who were in Iran, it was about working with people who had already made a decision to leave the country, because then, of course, they had to come with us to Germany to complete the shoot. But you should also know that in Iran, we only shot with 2 actors. All the others were already in Germany. And in fact, there are some scenes where you see one of the characters who's been kidnapped with their face covered. It's actually another actor playing them. But you should not understand, but it was the only way to proceed. And in fact, that's why their face was covered, but also the voice was changed in post.
Interesting,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Yes, everything that was shot in interiors was filmed abroad, and I worked very precisely on the windows to really ensure that you felt that you were in Tehran and that things were happening outside those windows.
Yeah, that was really interesting, because we watched the film again last night. We were trying to figure out that it must have been done on stage, but it did give you the sense of being very much in the city. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you again, just more in a sort of technical way of working, because I think manuscripts don't burn and A Man of Integrity are 2 of the most beautiful films I've seen. And how do you manage such a standard of visual eloquence in such conditions when it kind of puts us in Hollywood to shame, quite honestly?
So
they detained me for about 2 hours, and then they confiscated my passport and all my electronic devices, but they told me, you're free. However, I couldn't leave the country for quite a while after, and had no idea what had happened to my electronic devices. And only about 20 days earlier, Rouhani had been elected as the new president of Iran, with a great focus on civil rights. And I think that at the time, the government was very keen to show that it really stuck to its words, it enacted what it said. And it was very keen to show a new face of the Islamic Republic to the world.
توی همین شرایط که من بازجویی می شدم و به هر حال به اداره سانسور میرفتم که
And they couldn't stand me anymore because I kept insisting, telling them, but you keep talking about personal rights. I just want to make a film. Please give me this permit. And so eventually, after all the pressure I kept exerting on them, maybe it took about 1 year and a half, they finally gave me a filming permit, but depending on a promise I made to them, a sort of a written agreement, that I would make a story with hope. I would tell a film that had a story full of, that had some hope in it.
یه چیزایی نوشته بودن، منم بهشون تعهد دادم و یه اجازه فیلمبرداری گرفتم بالاخره. بالاخره من موفق شدم.
So finally, for once, with really some calm, some respite, and removed from the habitual pressure, I was able to complete filming A Man of Integrity.
فیلمبرداری لرد رو تموم کردم.
And then I decided to submit, to send the film to a film festival in Iran. I thought it would be good to present it. And around midnight, I received an SMS from the head of the censorship office, a very angry, very upset message asking me, what did you think you were doing with this film? What sort of film is it? And everything, the whole sort of circle, the whole circus started off again.
Oh my.
They said the film had no artistic value whatsoever, that it was a very bad film and therefore they couldn't show it. Of course, it was screened at Cannes a few months later. And in fact, it was awarded the top prize of Un Certain Regard. I was out of Iran before the film's premiere at Cannes was announced. And then in September 2017, I finally returned to Iran and again was arrested at the airport upon my arrival.
و دیگه از 2017
I simply stayed in Iran without ever leaving the country from 2017 until 2024 because my passport had been confiscated. I wasn't allowed to leave the country. And of course, throughout this period, I served time in prison and so on and so forth.
Did you have to submit a script, though? I mean, it's interesting that they said they wanted a hopeful end or something, and you couldn't really say A Man of Integrity has that. Did you have to submit a script?
من یه فیلمنامه دیگه بهشون دادم که خیلی
Yes, but I submitted a different script. It used the same identical locations, but it was a different script.
Right. Sure.
و درباره امید.
Of course, in Persian, Omid is also the word for hope is also a name, a male name. So in A Man of Integrity, there is a character called Omid, and so I told them, well, there is hope in the film.
Oh.
Wow. So strictly it's true, but if that's a film with your idea of hope, I don't know what. Yeah.
و خیلی عصبانی شدن.
Obviously, the regime got very angry because of this, and this led to sort of years and years of stories.
But I really want to go back and ask you again. Sorry, but how do you work? I mean, because you're under such sort of scrutiny. Do you have time with the actors prior to shooting to rehearse? And do you make storyboards? And what's your process?
خب این دو تا فیلم تولیدش
you can't really, the two were just had such different production and prep and shooting processes, because on the one hand, manuscripts was filmed almost guerrilla-like, with a very small crew, with very limited equipment. Whereas A Man of Integrity, the situation was entirely different because I finally had a filming permit. So I had much less stress, and it was much easier to prep because we didn't sort of have to prepare for the eventuality of needing to hide. Or not the eventuality, we didn't have to plan how we'd hide throughout the shoot. And of course, we could approach and negotiate with a much wider group of potential collaborators. So it really was a pretty different game of balls.
But again, do you storyboard? Do you
shot list?
Do you shot list, or do you kind of work with the actors on the day?
خیلی فرق میکنه.
I don't have a sort of fixed way of working. Even just if I look at these two films, it really depends on the requirement of each scene. And I'm very flexible. So yes, at times I've got a very precise shot list, and at times I change it on set. I improvise on set, or I sort of work through the mise en scène on set. So I don't, it's quite hard to answer because it really depends.
Sure. I mean, I think that becomes quite apparent on your next film, There Is No Evil, which has 4 different stories, and each is kind of told in a different style, really, which is kind of interesting. So can you talk about There Is No Evil? Did the idea of that film come out of your time in jail?
So one day, about towards the end of 2018, I was driving, and so I'd been banned from leaving Iran for about 2 years by now. And all of a sudden, I saw one of my ancient interrogators from 2010 coming out of the bank. And I was really shocked. I thought, oh my God, I'm mistaken. It can't be him. So I sort of braked quite suddenly, and had a good look at him. But no, I realized that it really was him. And so I stopped and observed him. And he had a car parked nearby up the street. So he just entered his car. And at that point, I started following him with my car. Initially I was really angry, and then I took out my phone and I started taking pictures and videos of him. And then he stopped, so I stopped immediately. He got down, I got down too, and kind of sort of followed him at a certain distance. And he did some grocery shopping. He bought some fruit, and then he got back into his car. I got back into my car, and what really struck me was the normality of what he was doing. He just looked like anyone else, and if someone had been observing him from the outside without knowing that he was or had been an interrogator, they wouldn't have believed it. And that's how the film began. The idea for There Is No Evil came to me.
That sounds like the opening story, which you don't know where it's going. You just see daily life, which is fascinating, especially for somebody who's never been to Iran. And then finally, the guy goes into the jail and pushes the button, and you see the feet of the hanging men. It's quite an extraordinary, beautiful sequence. I mean, in the way it's constructed and the pacing of it. So what else were the challenges of doing a film like that? It seems, I love all your films, but it probably is my favorite, if you can say favorite of a film like that. But it's, can you just talk about, again, the challenges of making it and the different choices of the style you used?
Well, I was very worried about censorship, and especially if the regime got wind that I was shooting a film and came and blocked the filming, what to do. And so I realized that if I made a series of short films and then sort of combined them together into one film, I would probably be able to get away with it without being disturbed.
بنابراین تصمیم گرفتم که به یه موضوع واحد با یه تم مشخص از زوایای
So I decided to tell a story that concerns a very clear theme, but explored from different angles. And also what was very important to me was not to see only the victims of the system, but also to swivel the camera around to show people who say no.
این بود که طی مثلا یک
So over the course of 1 year, I wrote these 4 different shorts, and then we went about filming them one by one.
Were you imprisoned after this movie too?
نه بعد از این فیلم
So in a way I was meant to, but then COVID began, and so I left Tehran.
از تهران رفتم بیرون.
And the regime decided to delay my sentence because, there were so many problems they were dealing with COVID, also inside prisons. But I didn't go back to prison until 2022.
سال 2021 اواخر 2021 یکی از دوستای من که شاعر
Then at the end of 2021, a friend of mine, the poet and filmmaker Bartosz Obtin, died of COVID in prison. It was an indirect murder in a way because the regime, it's not as if they killed him all of a sudden, but they let him go to waste. They didn't take care of his health, and obviously it was very difficult for me.
ولی در واقع یه جوری قتل دیگه ولی من یه مستند راجع به این موضوع ساختم.
I made a documentary about him, about this, and was arrested again. Also because I had these sort of overhanging sentences that I had not served. And so I was held for 35 days in solitary confinement, and at that point transferred into the sort of general section of the prison. I'd been in prison for a few months in 2022 when the Women Life Freedom movement began. And I felt that something really quite remarkable, new, unseen was happening outside, but trying to follow it from within the walls of the prison was a really interesting experience. So, the time I spent in prison had to do with previous sentences, but I had this. I was due to be sentenced again for other matters, and my lawyers predicted that I'd be sentenced to 8 years in prison.
I was just interested. I read somewhere while you were in prison, I think it must have been this time, one of your guards or somebody in the prison had a thumb drive of There Is No Evil, and you watched the film with them.
Not quite that way. What happened was that while I was in prison, I was due to have a small surgery, which meant I was transferred to the prison's hospital twice for 1 week each time. Each time I was transferred to the hospital, I was escorted by 2 soldiers who acted as guards, and they were under the supervision of one armed prison official. So they all not only escorted me, but they stayed with me inside of the room where I was hospitalized and sat on either side of my bed. So the 3 officials in charge of guarding me changed every 24 hours. So over the course of 1 week, I had 7 different 2 soldiers sitting on either side and 7 different armed officials in charge of supervising them.
خب سربازا متوجه شدن که من کی
these two
هستم
soldiers were really quite taken in when I discovered who I was, that, you know, that they thought it was very interesting that they should be guarding, that there was a filmmaker in prison and they were guarding him, and they really wanted to talk to me. And then they went and looked up my films and were really interested to discover them, that one of them features prison soldiers. And so they downloaded the film, they put it on a USB stick, and towards the evening and nighttime, when there was a less of risk that senior officials would come to inspect that part of the prison, I had to watch the film with them lying in bed.
What did they think of it?
و به من میگفتم وای چه فیلمیه، وای این خود ماییم، وای چه فیلمی ساختی.
I should also add that I watched it 7 times with 7 different sets of soldiers. And as they watched them, they were all like, wow, what a film. Wow, this is a film about us.
عکس العملشون دقیقاً این بود که احساس می‌کردن خودشون رو می‌بینن.
Well, they seemed very happy to be watching a film about themselves, but at the same time, they were looking for reasons to convince themselves that they should be there, that there was a good reason for them to do what they were doing.
Right.
به هر حال من 14 بار این فیلم رو تو بیمارستان با پرسنل زندان.
So all in all, I had to watch the film 10 times with the prison's hospital personnel, and by the end I was really crying. I don't want to see this film anymore.
What would those guards usually watch then? What kind of movies would they usually be watching?
بیشتر براشون این موضوع جالب بود که کارگردانی که یه فیلمی ساخته دارن باشه.
Normally, during work, if it hadn't so happened that they happened to be guarding a director and that director had made a film, 2 episodes out of 4 which concerned people like them, I think that was really what I found so interesting about the whole experience. But if that had not been the case, while on duty, I think they would have just watched some TV or even just listened to music. But of course, all this time while watching the film, I had both of them sat on each side, and also obviously I had sort of one handcuff and also, I don't know if this is how you call it, a foot cuff connected to the bed. So I was really tied down to the bed I was in with these 2 soldiers, having to watch my own film time and time again.
I mean, they must have been kind of surprised watching There Is No Evil compared with the films. I was asking really, what films would they generally watch in a cinema or in Iran anyway, in general?
Well, yes, because usually you can't find my films or films of this kind in cinemas in Iran.
Right.
Well, you know, the films that are screened mostly at cinemas in Iran are entertaining films, atrocious films, seriously, that are allowed to be screened just to distract people a little bit from their anger. And Iranian cinema has really lost most of its human values. So that's what you get if that's where you go and watch films.
Mm-hmm. Did the moral dilemma of the guards in the movie resonate at all with them? Did they respond at all to the idea of these characters having to do something so awful?
سوال سختیه برای اینکه من هیچ
It's a very difficult question to answer because I've got no way of assessing whether this ethical dilemma impacted them or did not.
ولی امید من اینه که یعنی من با این امید این فیلمو میسازم، همیشه اینجور فیلمو رو میسازم.
But of course I make films of this sort always with the hope that it will leave an impact.
Did you ever, and the reverse idea, did you ever look at the guards and imagine that one day they might be your executioner?
نه هیچ وقت اینجوری فکر نکردم، ولی
No, I never thought about that. I really never looked at things that way. But I do have to say that whilst I was in prison, at least 10 people I knew were hanged, and likewise.
یکی از کسایی که توی زندان ملاقاتش کرده بودم در اعتراض به
Someone I met in prison killed himself yesterday in protest against the state by throwing himself from a sort of great height.
So, I mean, I think you have to recognize that if your films weren't so good and so insightful, the regime wasn't so feeble in its own way, they wouldn't react the way they do to them. But then tell us, because now you're at this point, you're probably going to be sentenced to 8 years in prison. But then you go on to make your last film in Iran, The Seed of the Sacred Fig. Can you tell us about your thinking at that point? I mean, that must have taken enormous courage from you, but also all the people you work with. I just find that remarkable that at this point in your life, with all that's gone on, you make, well, it is a masterpiece of political
statements. Yeah.
Yes, so by now I was in prison, the Women Life Freedom movement had begun, there were lots of new arrests ensuing this movement. The prisons were so full that the regime didn't know how to accommodate all these new prisoners, and they were forced really to grant a public pardon to a number of political prisoners.
من آزاد شدم و از خودم سوال کردم که با توجه به اینکه خبرنگارا اجازه ندارن در زمان
I happened to be among these political prisoners who were granted pardon, and as soon as I came out, I asked myself what had happened while I was in prison. And obviously in prison we only had access to state-controlled media where you never see an image of the protesters, and so I decided that I really wanted to look videos to understand what had happened, and especially get to know this extraordinary young generation. And these videos were really astounding, both in the way they depicted, they documented the violence of repression, but also the resistance, the fearless resistance, the courage. Yeah. They really had a huge impact on me. And of course, I brought some ideas from before that had to do with my time that had happened during my time in prison with me. And I started writing a story, but then realized it was very ambitious, that it was quasi-impossible to film.
با همکارایی که به هر حال دوست داشتن با هم دیگه
but then I spoke
یه خورده حرف زدیم
with my collaborators who were so keen to work on a new project together, and they gave me really the wherewithal to get it off the ground, and all we had to work out primarily was how to reduce to the minimum the risks filming it would have entailed.
راهایی که به ذهنمون رسید این بود که گروه رو کوچیک کنیم.
The strategies we came up to were primarily three, that we should be a very small cast and crew,
دانشجویی خیلی محدود تا جایی که میتونیم,
that we would use as little equipment as we could. In fact, it was often more limited than that of a student film, even. And that I should direct at a certain distance from the set. And of course, these were strategies that we employed in order to minimize the danger both of being arrested, but also of the shoot being blocked. And of course, having this impending, presumably 8-year prison sentence, I was really worried also because if I were to be arrested on set or whilst filming, presumably I would be given another 8-year prison sentence or something along those lines. And so really the idea of spending all those years in prison was quite something.
Yeah.
به هر حال ما فیلمبرداری رو شروع کردیم.
At any rate, we started filming with this very tight-knit group, and during the 4th week of the shoot, I was indeed sentenced to 8 years in prison.
حکم اول دادگاه اول به من ابلاغ شد. خیلی کار سختی بود برای اینکه
It was very difficult to maintain my concentration and to really keep my wits together whilst working.
نگه داشتن خودم توی صحنه واقعا کار بسیار دشواری شده بود برام. واقعا
Some days I really felt I couldn't make it at all. I couldn't continue.
و دوستانم
But my friends always helped me to get myself back on my feet.
And after you got sentenced, were you able to continue shooting, or what did you do at that point? Because you weren't finished the movie yet, right?
خیلی دستپاچه با وکلام تماس گرفتم.
Yes, so without disclosing anything about the film I was shooting, I asked my lawyers how much time it would take to appeal against the sentence and for a new sentence to be made, which would be definitive. There would be no chance to appeal against that one.
بعد حدود چند هفته طول می‌کشه.
And they told me, well, about 20 days for us to appeal, and then about 2 weeks for the second sentence to come out, and then... Sorry, I'm getting something in the timings wrong, and then for 2 weeks there's the Iranian New Year holidays, and all in all it seemed that I had about 2 months max. And I tried my best with the support of my amazing cast and crew, and luckily we were able to wrap the shoot throughout that time.
And you also caught COVID during the shoot. Tell us about that.
واقعا تو صحنه‌هایی که
it was terrible because I had a 40-degree temperature and I had to sort of shoot remotely and be all the time on the monitor, see what the actors were doing, give directions. I mean, it certainly wasn't a good experience.
دیگه یه روزی شد که دیگه نمیتونستم، یعنی دیگه همه اطرافیان توی گروه نگران شدن.
And then one day came where I really couldn't make it anymore, and my cast and crew were very worried that I might, something pretty serious might happen, and that I had to get myself to hospital. However,
بیمارستان برم، بنابراین
I couldn't enter a hospital with my name, disclosing my identity, and so they somehow managed to secure someone else's ID so I could get myself to hospital using someone else's identity.
یکم بهتر شدم ولی
I got a bit better, and we shot all we had to shoot in the ancient village you see in the film, Kharonak, and we returned to Tehran.
Mentioning that ancient village, you see at the beginning, you see at the end. Is that a very deliberate statement about the old Iran? It's a juxtaposition between the story and the what Iran used to, the wonders of Iran in the past.
شاید بهترین تعبیری که میتونم از
Well, I think the best way I can describe this beautiful location is that it's a symbolic image of Iran where we see a beautiful and yet destroyed Iran in ruin, a beautiful country in ruins.
Right. Right.
And we see, of course, the power of patriarchy within this ongoing struggle between tradition and modernity in modern Iranian history, following women.
در نهایت فکر میکنم که
in the end, I always think
اندیشه های مدرن
new thoughts will triumph over tradition.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, for us, I think in the supposed liberal democracies, I think your films act as a warning at how fragile our own systems can be. How do you see your now? It's commonly common knowledge how you escaped from Iran after filming. How do you see your role now as a filmmaker outside of the country?
اینکه من بیرون هستم الان
The most important reason why I am outside of Iran today is I decided I did not want to play the role of a filmmaker victim of the censorship apparatus. Whether that meant spending time in prison or whether that meant living in an environment where I would not be able to make films. So I'm here to tell the many stories I still want to tell. Obviously, I've got no idea what's going to happen, but I do know that I shall try my best.
Well, we look forward to seeing what you do.
Yes, we want to.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Say we're such admirers of your work, and may you make many more films. Thank you so much.
خیلی ممنونم که منو به برنامه‌شون دعوت کردم. گفتگوی لذت بخشی بود.
Thank you so much for having me on your program, and it was a real pleasure talking to you both.
مرسی برای ترجمه. بای بای.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.